Hello and welcome to the latest edition of my beginner's guide for Python. Today's video is going to cover data types and casting data types, which is just changing one data type to another. So what is a data type? When we're programming, everything has a type. Up to now we've looked at the string type, which is just text. Strings are text. So if I do name equals like that, we've defined a variable, we assigned, using the equal sign, the value or the contents of the quotes, which is must pain, and that's just text, that's just a string. We also have an integer data type, which is just whole numbers, which is 20. It's an integer. And we also have floating point numbers, which might be like that. Any decimal number is a floating point number, or a float for short. Now, remember back to the last video, we covered naming of variables. I can call something an integer because most of the time when we talk about ints, the short version is int, and Python recognizes int. Python also recognizes float, so you can't call a variable either int or float. Right, so next thing to note is that anything inside of quotations, even numbers, are still strings. So if I start with a quick example and do number 1 equals 20, and then I do number 2 equals number 1 plus 5, print number 2. I'm not sure what you're expecting to happen here, but have a think what you think might happen, then let's see what does happen. What we've got is an error. Now this error can be a little bit confusing, but if you remember, I was calling the joining of strings previously concatenation. I was saying we're going to concatenate them, and str is short for string. So what it's saying is it can only concatenate type string, not integer. And what that's saying is that we have a string here, but here we've got an integer because that's a number, and we can't join them together. It's like adding apples and oranges together. It just doesn't make sense. Okay, so the next point is that an input is always a string. So if I change this to number 1 equals input, please enter a whole number, and I run this again, asks us for the whole number, so I can enter 50, and we have exactly the same error because this is still a string, because input always gives us a string. Okay, so how can we cast this, or how can we change this to be an integer so we could do some maths with it? Let's take it back to that. What I can do, I'm going to change this to number 3, change that to number 2. In fact, I'm going to relabel these. So string number equals 20. Integer version of the number equals integer. And then what we do is we put that string version into the parentheses. So str number. And then we're going to do some maths on that. So number 2 equals int number plus 5. Okay, so what we're doing, we're going to convert that, which is a piece of text, however it looks like a number, so we can convert it into an integer type. And I've called it int number just so it's very clear what we're dealing with. That is the int we saw before, and this is telling it to cast this value, or the value contained in that variable, into an integer. And then we're going to add 5 to it and print the result. And exactly what we might expect, 20 plus 5 is 25. Now we can do this with an input as well. Input. So we're going to ask for a whole number, and then it's exactly the same process. So run again. And the difference is this time I'm going to enter a whole number. Invalid literal for integer with base 10. Just let me run that again, because I think I typed that in wrong. Run module. Yes, I just added an extra space, so you need to be careful. It's a good example actually. When you're entering these numbers, if you add a space, it won't recognise it as a number when you cast it, which is why I got this error here. So it's converted to 15. So that's okay, that works, and that shows us clearly what's happening. We're taking the input, we're assigning it to a variable called str number. We are then casting the str number into an integer and assigning it to a variable called int number. Then we are taking int number and adding the value 5 to it and assigning that to another variable called number 2, at which point we print number 2. However, you won't usually see this done like this, because what we can do is literally dump that, all of this inside these parentheses. So I've taken the whole input statement and put it inside the parentheses, which just makes it look that little bit cleaner and tidier. I was going to expand this out for a second because I just want to show you one thing. And that's these brackets. Every time we open a parentheses, remember, we have to have a closed parentheses. So we've got 1, 2, 1, 2. This parenthesis and this one are a pair, and then you've got this one and this one that are a pair. And if I run this now, it will give us exactly the same result. It's just a little bit cleaner, a little bit tidier, a little bit shorter. So what can we cast? We can do integers like we've seen. We can also do floating point numbers. And we can do booleans. We're going to cover booleans shortly, so let's start with a float. So number equals, that is a float or a decimal. A float is just a decimal. I mean, it's not, there's slightly more to it than that as you go further down into computer science, but for now a float is a decimal. And if I did that as a text, so str number again, so we're clear that this is the string version 2.05. Once again, if I try and add anything to that, as it is now, it won't work because it's a string and we'll get that concatenation error again. So to cast it, float number equals float. So it's exactly the same process. We're passing the string version inside a float parentheses, and then we can print the float version. We can also do that to something like that, so it starts as a whole number. But it will show 2.0 because it is now a float, so that is automatically there by default as a minimum level of detail. This would work exactly the same for an input. So, input please. (2.05). Right. I'm going to run this again because we can see that's worked in exactly the same way it was before, but I just want to show you once again what happens if you do something like it will give you that error where it's saying it can't convert again. Exactly the same way it did with an inch when I added an extra space by mistake. So if you do see these errors, just be careful with what you're typing in. Later on, we'll cover how to check for somebody doing that. It's a little bit beyond where we're at right now, but we will cover that later. For the time being, just be aware you have to be very careful not to include spaces or other characters when you're entering the information. Okay, so we've covered a lot, but we just need to talk a little bit about what happens with division, in particular with integer division. There are a lot of things you can do and get an expected result. For example, if I have number equals 10 and then I print number plus 2, we'll get what we expect. And if I do subtract 2, we'll also get what we expect. And if I do multiply by 2, now some of you may have not recognised that. That is the asterisk symbol. And in coding, we use that in place of the traditional multiply. Divide is replaced by the / character here. So let's do a divide. Let's see what happens. Now notice these have still been whole numbers. These are still integer values. So this time we've got a float value. It's got a decimal there. This varies from language to language, but in Python, anytime you divide an integer, it will convert it into a float, into a decimal value. And that's just for consistency, because it means it doesn't matter whether you're doing 2 divided by 2 or 2 divided by 3, you know that you will get a float answer. Okay, so what have we got? Oh, while we're in to the maths side of things, exactly what you might expect in normal mathematical rules applies in Python. So if I did 10 multiplied by -1, we'll get -10. If I multiply by a negative 0.5, we'll have -5. If I divide by negative 0.5, we'll have -20. So all your normal BODMAS rules apply. Brackets of multiply, divide, add, subtract. Brackets of so what does that of mean? Just means something before here. So brackets of divide, multiply, add, and then subtract. So the last one we need to look at is Booleans. We're not going to do a huge amount with Booleans, but we are going to use them quite a lot in the next video, so it's worth introducing them. Booleans are just true or false. And again, I can't use a bool as a variable name because Python knows that. That's a command in Python. So I'm just going to call it value1, and it can be either true, if I could type, or false. And that's it. That just relates to binary. True, false, on, off. It could also, they are also sometimes rated in numbers as 0 or 1, where 0 equals off, which equals false. Now that's not correct coding, that's just typing it so you can see it. The opposite is 1, is on, which is true. Now what is interesting is if we want to try and cast this. So what I'm doing is I'm taking, wrong one. I'm just saving myself time typing here. As you can see, this is all on the blog post. So we're going to start with a string value of false, and we're going to try and cast it to a bool in the same way we did before. Then we're going to take a string value true, and we're going to attempt to cast it into a bool in the same way that we did before. And then we're going to print the results. Unfortunately, this doesn't give an expected result. They're both true. But there's no error either, so we need to be very careful with Booleans for this reason. And in actual fact, the same happens if you try and multiply string values in Python. You get really unexpected results. So be very careful to make sure that you're casting correctly before you do any maths or know what you're expecting. If you're expecting false and you're getting true without an error, think about what you're doing. Now, remember I said that Booleans can also be represented as 0 or 1. If we take an input as, because we can't just take an input where somebody types true or false and cast it to a bool. What we can do is ask them to input 0 or 1. We can convert 0 into an integer value, convert 1 into an integer value. That's just going to print the integer values, and then this line casts the integer, sorry, highlighted the wrong bit. Here we cast the integer values and assign them to these new variables, and then we print those variables out. Sorry, excuse my alarm. So this time we can see that we've got the output we'd expect, false, true. And I just want to make the point as well here that while this code breaks everything down, we can simplify different stages here, because I can put those inside the print parentheses. It reduces the amount of code we have. And I could run that, and it'll work exactly the same way. Now, and again, this could all be combined. If I wanted to, I can put that into there. Now, the trouble is, this then potentially becomes less readable. I've reduced the number of lines of code, but it's not necessarily easier to read. But it will give exactly the same results. Okay, thank you for watching this latest video. It is part of a series I'm writing and creating videos for, covering Python for beginners. This time we've covered data types and casting. Thank you for watching. Bye.